It was pretty much you go through previous studies when we had gone through grace rightly divided, law rightly divided, all these different topical studies, and we're doing one every week, or if not twice a week. We're finding that when we go through this one, we're kind of letting other books of the Bible teach us about the mind of Christ, how God views different things, even if it's looking at different situations with different people and different dispensations. How does God view certain situations we'd never even be in? And so we're even seeing how the law is the schoolmaster to bring people to Christ. And so we had gone through part 1 last week. We went through about 14 chapters. And we'll go through the other, I'd say 14, but there are about 13 chapters we're going to go through. And we'll go through that today. And we saw this through those previous studies, law rightly divided. We did about 10 verses of Leviticus, and we said, let's go a little further into this. And so it provoked further thought into the book. And usually right dividers try to stay away from the book of Leviticus. They try to stay away from the book of Deuteronomy. They might, read from it, no problem. But, in order to go in depth into the book, it's kind of something like you go into it, people will think, I'm not going to go under law. If I read this book, someone may try to put me under the law, that kind of thing. But we're going into it intentionally to kind of see, what can we learn from the mind of Christ, from the mind of God, in the dispensation of grace, knowing that this is a book that people in the dispensation of grace are not going to literally obey. What can we learn from this book as we go through it? Seeing it how Paul would read this, for example. How would Paul present this to someone? How would Paul use this to help someone? Depending on every situation being a little bit different. But we had said last week, nobody in Leviticus looked forward to the cross, based on 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. If the devil could read Leviticus or any other book prior to Paul's epistles, what Jesus would do on the cross, he wouldn't allow it to happen. We know that from even Luke 18, 31 through 34. We took a look at that last week. And so the Lord did refer in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to Israel about Levitical times with Moses, and he said this, that he had to be lifted up just as Moses lifted up the serpent. We mentioned that in John 3:14 last week, and then we even gave a cross-reference to Hebrews chapter 10 last week, and that he should be exalted as a king in prophecy, earthly king. And so even going further, we know that what Paul says in Romans 6:14, that we're not under the law. Romans 15:4, whatsoever things are written aforetime, it's written for our learning. So we're going to go ahead and do a lot of learning from the book of Leviticus, a lot of learning. And that we see that there. We also know what Paul says through Romans chapter 3, verse 19 through 21 about the law. It shows people their sin, doesn't save anybody. 2 Corinthians 3:14 talks about how when I believe it was talking more about how it can kind of be a blinder, if anything. I'm kind of paraphrasing that verse, but it can blind someone. The veils on their hearts if all they read is the books and of the Old Testament. It doesn't really get into God's grace and how it expands upon the cross today. And still good Bible, still good. It's still God's word, but it's just not going to explain what God's doing today, per se. And so we see that there. They could search the scriptures from John 5:39, but they wouldn't find what God's doing today per the revelation of the mystery. And so that brought us to Galatians 3:24, that the law does have its purposes. It's good, it's spiritual, it's a right thing, it's a good thing, but we're not going to put ourselves under it. It's a schoolmaster to bring those that need it for Christ, to Christ. And so today we'll intentionally look at the book the way Paul would, the mind of Christ, learning again, like we said last week, historically, how God in his grace provides a lawful way for Israel to live in his presence, historically how he did that. He set up a middle wall of partition, separating Jew from Gentile. Spiritually, where we can learn and teach about things like atonement or reconciliation or holiness or grace or faith. Of course, from the prophetic perspective, how we can learn that, how we could maybe take lessons from this book and throw it into what Paul's teaching or doing and how that could help. So we'll do that. Of course, Paul's epistles is where we're looking to bring everything to, because Paul's lessons are more verbatim for us. They're greater. They're going to apply far greater to us. This is something that's going to teach us some things, but Paul's epistles are more direct. So it's going to be many spiritual lessons we find here in Leviticus that'll be beneficial, but the ultimate lessons we want to verbatim, and directly find is in Paul's epistles. So that's historically and spiritually. Doctrinally, for our learning, like we saw in Romans 15:4, how this book could be used, with the revelation of the mystery at the forefront, and also how it could be used by Israel, the little flock of Israel, whether they're going through the tribulation in ages to come, whether they're in their Old Testament in time past. We'll see. We'll take a look at that. And pretty much when somebody says, what's this book for? If someone is just, a new Christian, or they're religious, or they're an atheist, or whatever it is, and they come up to you and they say, well, what am I going to do with this book? Why do I need to read the book of Leviticus? Especially when you tell me to go read Romans through Philemon, you'll have some answers as to what this book has to present to somebody. And in light of, you want to bring them to Romans through Philemon anyway, have them read that first. But what do all these other books have to say anyway? What's valuable in these other books? And we'll just take a look, for example, at the book of Leviticus, just to see what's in there and what we can benefit from, we can learn from. So we'll do that, and we'll take a look at that. And so when they say, what's this book for? What's this book about? Why is this book there? Why do I need to read it? That type of thing. We'll start to see what's in it and find out some answers. We took a look at it last week with part 1. We'll continue on it this week with part 2. And then just for an example, if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10. And this is something we didn't add last week that we're going to put in this week. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10. We're going to take an example from another book. And that's more so Deuteronomy, more than Leviticus. But we're just taking this as an example. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10, what Paul goes on to say, and we saw this when we did verse by verse in 1 Corinthians a while back. It says, actually, 1 Corinthians 9:9, we'll get into 10. It says, for it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? For he, or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, or that he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. So when we read that, we see that's Deuteronomy 25:4 that Paul is taking and using to explain the benefits of what's written. He's talking to the Corinthians, who are the members of the body of Christ. He's taking a verse from Deuteronomy, and he's explaining God cares for oxen. God cares for, essentially God cares for laborers. And when you plow in hope. When you work with hope. So he's taking that as a lesson just to teach the Corinthians about. He's saying that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9 and 10. And so that's kind of what we're doing with this entire book of Leviticus, is we're kind of going back there. We're going to kind of do what Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 9 and 10, kind of taking some lessons out of it and learning some things historically, doctrinally, and spiritually that you're seeing Paul do to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9 to 10. So we're seeing a little bit from there. And then as we continue through our outline, I put the last 4 chapters we went through last week, and we did, I believe it was we left off in chapter 15. But chapter 11 was, going through the Levitical diet. We saw how it was respectively in context with clean and unclean, or holiness versus sin, that kind of idea. We took some lessons out of that chapter. Chapter 12 set up the wall of partition. In some cases, it was associated with childbirth, and we saw how you could take Leviticus chapter 12, present it to somebody, especially, say, a religious Roman Catholic, and present how, Mary in Luke chapter 2, I believe it was verse 22, how she obeyed Leviticus chapter 12. You could run with that, explain that to somebody who doesn't even know that. Chapter 13, we had talked about, a person has sinned, they're going to wash and make it holy. Leprosy with conditions, just as a garment has mold, wash it and clean it, that kind of idea. Restoration, the concept of restoration. We had gone into Ephesians chapter 5 and Ephesians chapter 2, kind of comparing, contrasting the lessons we can learn from that. And Leviticus chapter 14, this is where we left off, how an object needs purification through blood and water. And we ended up seeing that when we had looked at John chapter 19. We saw that when the Spirit had gone through Christ, blood and water came out. And so Christ would be our purification through blood and water when he was through his death, burial, and resurrection. So you learn a little more detail about that. And so we see a little bit of something through there, some lessons that we're just learning through this, some benefit. What's written, the 4 times written for our learning. So now we're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to go and continue with our chapter for chapter. Again, doing word by word and verse by verse in Leviticus would be quite the adventure. But when we're going through something like this and we're just finding information that doesn't directly apply to us, it can be a little bit tough. And we're going through rules and laws specifically. It's better maybe to do a broad brush than maybe word for word and verse for verse. So we're going to kind of go a little bit quick through the book and reap the benefits of chapter for chapter. So where we left off last time was in chapter 15, I'm sorry. And we see through the first 5 verses in Leviticus chapter 15. It goes on to read, and the Lord spoke in verse 1, chapter 15, verse 1, and the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When any man hath a running issue out of his flesh, because of his issue he is unclean. And this shall be his uncleanness in his issue. Whether his flesh run with his issue, or his flesh be stopped from his issue, it is his uncleanness. Every bed whereon he lieth that hath the issue is unclean, and everything whereon he sitteth shall be unclean. And whosoever toucheth his bed shall wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even. And it goes on to explain more from there. So I don't want to read the whole entire chapter, but it does give a little benefit of explaining more about the body and the physical infirmities and what needs to be done concerning washings and everything else. And so we see that having a right heart is going to be more so the issue with God as far as physical infirmity, and we can learn a little bit about that more so. We see also the intricate detail God gives concerning all these laws. So when you read not only these laws, but when you read things like genealogies, and you say, why do I need to read a genealogy about this guy's the son of this guy and that guy's the son of this guy? And as you go through and you read more and say Joshua, and you read about this guy comes from the house of this guy who comes from the house of this guy, and these rules and these laws, and this person has an issue, and this is how you wash him, and this is how you sacrifice the animal here, and you remove the liver and you take the kidneys, and why is there so much intricate detail, and what am I supposed to do with this? Well, one thing you can do with it is enjoy the benefit of how detailed God is. A lot of times in religion, you have a God who you can't know, you can't understand, you don't know how he thinks, and you don't know how detailed he is when he speaks. In the Bible, you see how explicitly detailed he is, to the point where you're learning multitude of generations of a single individual. And you're learning how detailed God is when he gives out an order to sacrifice an animal, to the point he's giving you explicit details on what to do with the insides of an animal in order to sacrifice it. And in this case, with Leviticus 15, you're seeing what to do when it comes to certain issues, with the body and physical infirmities and so on and so forth, to the point you're learning the mind of God and how extremely detailed he wants the person to understand how extremely detailed he is. And so we see this in his word here. And so, having a right heart will be an issue in order to understand that. But we look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, for example, in order to drive this point home a little bit better. Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. And what we see here, when it comes to the idea of, physical infirmities or things like that, I guess the most important thing that we see here in the dispensation of grace concerning physical infirmities and members that are unclean, or members that have, as we're reading in Leviticus 15, discharges or uncleanness or whatever, we see in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 says, Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry, for which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience. So what's more important than, say, the physical infirmity of an individual in the dispensation of grace would be more so the members which are upon the earth, such as, and you're seeing the fornication and the uncleanness and the inordinate affection, the matters of the heart are what's going to be more important than so the physical infirmity. Because eventually, at one point or another, we're all going to die of a physical infirmity if we're not caught up first. So the physical infirmity is not the issue as much as it is the the members which are upon the earth, the matters of the heart. If we look also at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3, and in Ephesians 5:3, it goes on to read this as well. It goes on to talk about this. It says that, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becoming saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. So there's a certain way that Paul would have us address or speak or whatever, and we're finding it's not foolish talking, but giving of thanks. There's a certain way to address, there's a certain way of matters of the heart that we're finding that Paul is addressing in Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, and it's more so the matters of the heart than the issues of the flesh. And we're finding out there based on what we can learn from as we compare and contrast Leviticus chapter 15 from Paul's epistles. And this is something you can compare and contrast, and prophecy from mystery, showing what the difference is. If God sets up a wall in prophecy, he breaks it through in the mystery. It shows it through how God is dealing with different people at different times. And we're showing that here through the book of Leviticus. So we see that there in chapter 15. As we go through into chapter 16, it moves on to talk more about the Day of Atonement. And there's a lot more in there than that. But it goes on with the idea that the sins of the people are transferred to a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is laden with sins and released. And sin is indeed put away. So we look at Leviticus chapter 16, verse 7. And you see an example of this in Leviticus 16:7. It goes on to read that, and he, talking about the Aaron or Moses and the priest, he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell and offer him for sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make an atonement with him and to let him go for a scapegoat into the wilderness. And Aaron shall bring the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and shall make an atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And it goes on just more and more talking about coals of fire and so on and so forth that we're reading here. It goes all the way down, talking more about this, about the mercy seat in verse 15. Verse 16 goes on to read, and he shall make an atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel. And because of their transgressions and all their sins, so shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation that remaineth among them in the midst of their uncleanness. So you see in verse 16, atonement is eventually made. So we're taking the theme of atonement, made to the scapegoat. And so, of course, you can already see where this is going, this kind of theme, this kind of idea that, reconciliation and atonement is made for, in this case, the tabernacle of the congregation. We're not a Jewish tabernacle of the congregation. We're not going through the wilderness. Multiple theologies will tell you otherwise, but they're going to be wrong in their identity. So they're going to be wrong in what God's doing today. But we're learning whatsoever things are written aforetime, written for our learning. We're learning from it. We're seeing some good understanding from this, God's mind on the subject, how he's dealing with people in Leviticus, how they can walk in his presence in Leviticus. And therefore, we're seeing how we can do even better than that, but how the theme is there. And when I say we, I mean how God is doing better than that, and how we can go to Paul's epistles to learn better than that. So what I mean by that, so we're going to go, say, for example, to Romans chapter 4 in verse 25. And I think we did this a little bit last week as well, but in Romans chapter 4 in verse 25, what we see here, talking about justification and redemption, reconciliation and atonement, for example, we're seeing here it talks about in Romans 4:25, the Lord Jesus Christ, sacrifice, or if you want to say that scapegoat who had was released and atoned for sin, just that theme, that idea, says that who was delivered for our offenses and was raised again for our justification. That's the Lord Jesus Christ, the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate atonement. in which we've now received the atonement, who was delivered for our offenses and was raised again for justification. So we see that there. And then we see we even have something based on that in Romans chapter 8, let's say verse 34. Romans chapter 8, verse 34 talks about this atonement, talks about the sacrifice and reconciliation and how it applies to us and what it means for us. Romans 8, verse 34 goes on to say, well, who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Then who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Of course, you take this back to Leviticus, the answer would be, well, sure, of course it can. But here in Romans, we're finding we have eternal security. And therefore, knowing these things, knowing these facts, knowing these verses, knowing the doctrine, we know that prophecy is different than mystery. As we rightly divide the word of truth, we understand that there is a world of difference. We're not them, they're not us, and therefore we can rejoice in the fact of Romans 8, the entire book of Romans, let alone the other epistles that speak to God's truth today in the dispensation of grace. Therefore, we can go back and learn some things in these other books. And therefore we find, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or naked or peril or sword? And of course, our answer is no. And then it says, for as it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. And that's Psalms. If we wanted to go through Psalms, and we went through it once, I believe. We did Psalms and Proverbs rightly divided. That was another study we did. This is Psalms 44. It says, nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And indeed we are. So we see that as we go through Leviticus chapter 16. Then as we move on into Leviticus chapter 17, we're finding this is more so the blood chapter. I'll call it that. But we see in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 1, it goes on to read, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, and unto all the children of Israel, and say unto them, this is the thing which the Lord hath commanded, saying, what man soever there be of the house of Israel that killeth an ox, or lamb, or goat, in the camp, or that killeth it out of the camp, and bringeth it not into the floor of the tabernacle of the congregation, to offer an offering unto the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood shall be imputed unto that man. He hath shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. So what they're saying in this, it's interesting to learn. You're seeing the mind of God and the laws that he gives to Israel, is that there was a reason and a purpose why blood was to be shed. If someone just went and started killing bulls and goats and rams and whatever, and just did it for the heck of it, just because they wanted to do it, just because they love to kill or whatever, God's saying, well, no, you can't just go and kill animals just for no reason. There has to be a purpose. You have to do it God's way. You have to do. Even when you as it says here, when you kill an ox or a lamb or a goat or whatever, you got to do it God's way, and you have to do it for God's purposes. You don't just do things, for your own personal reasons. And so we see that there in verse 17 when it comes to in this case killing. And so we see that's verses 1 through 4. But then in verse 11, Leviticus 17:11 explains quite a lot about just the very concept of blood itself, which you can take into Paul's epistles, you can take into pretty much everywhere, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can take it into as everywhere you read it. It says, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. So this is God's standard. This is God's principle. This is something we can kind of take and say, why does God, you'll hear the atheists talking about, well, you've got a bloodthirsty God and I don't, or atheists don't believe in God, but why is your God so bloodthirsty? Why is your God so this? Well, Leviticus 17:11 explains that it's the blood that makes an atonement for the soul. He says, so are you going to go out and murder someone? He said, no, we have an atonement already. It's Jesus Christ. And so that's what we find based on Leviticus 17:11. That's why going into these books explains how God thinks, why God does what he does, and how we can take that even further into Paul's epistles. Now, Paul knew these books. We're learning these books. We're rightly dividing these books, so we're gaining the benefit from these books. And so we're seeing that here, and we go through Leviticus 17, the blood chapter, quote unquote. How it cleanses from sin. We won't turn to it, but 1 John chapter 1, verse 7 explains this to the little flock of Israel, and we can learn from that too. And it goes on to explain more. Ephesians 1:7, Colossians 1:14, Ephesians 2:13 talks about how we've been saved by his blood, purchased by his blood, cleansed by his blood. And if we look at Colossians 1:20, just while we're going there, look at a cross-reference. Colossians 1:20, as we see all this from the idea of learning so much from Leviticus. Colossians 1:20 says, and having made peace through the blood of his cross. Now, there was bloodshed, and Leviticus 17:11 explains how the mechanics of this all works. And having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself, by him I say, whether they be things on earth or things in heaven. And you that were sometime alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath he reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable in his sight. So, of course, by mankind's sight, they look at believers or grace believers or right dividers, and they say, in my sight, you're garbage, you're nothing, you're trash, or whatever the word, go beyond that. But in God's sight, based on the cross, based on making peace through the blood of the cross, we're finding that in God's sight, we see through verse 22, we're presented holy, unblameable, and unreprovable. So we find that there through Colossians, and we're finding this based on what we're learning through the mechanics of blood, Christ's blood, no less, God's blood, no less, in Leviticus, the mechanics of it in Leviticus 17. Of course, the blood that we see was used through animals in Leviticus 17, but this goes further when we get into Paul's epistles based on how God deals progressively with mankind. So we saw that in Leviticus 17. And then it goes on furthermore. So, of course, I would encourage to read all of Leviticus 17 or the whole book of Leviticus, and in fact, the whole Bible. But then we get into Leviticus 18. Now we're getting into some, a battleground chapter here. And so it deals with having right relationships. And so we see in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 1, it says that, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein ye dwelt, ye shall not do. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, ye shall not do. Neither shall ye walk in their ordinances. Ye shall do my judgments, and keep mine ordinances, to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. So we're seeing just from those first 5 verses in Leviticus 18, how important God is making it known. You're surrounded, Israel, by people of other nations, and you've come out from a previous nation, which you were in bondage with. And I don't want you to obey anything that you used to do, and I don't want you to be obeying anything that you're surrounded by. And he's saying, you obey my statutes and my ordinances, and you can see the spiritual lesson we can learn from that in these first five verses of Leviticus 18. We're surrounded by an ungodly society. We're not to do anything that they do, or as we, essentially the lesson we're to learn from it would be, Romans 12. We're not to conform to, this world, but be transformed through the renewing of our minds. God's adding more detail to that concept. We can take spiritual lessons out of Leviticus 18 through that. And, Paul explains it better, of course. And yet we can learn from this. So he says this here in Leviticus 18, but the battleground comes in Leviticus 18:22. And I think it's in Leviticus 18:22. We read there, it says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is abomination. So we're seeing this here, God's mind on the subject, God's word on the subject. We know that in Romans 1, it confirms Leviticus 18. And Christians everywhere say that, no, God doesn't think that, God doesn't say that. And he clearly says it right here. So he does say this not only in Leviticus 18, and we learn his mind on the subject, but he also goes on to go even further than that. And we know that through Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, verses 1 through 10. But even in 1 Kings 14:14, A lot of people don't read that or know that, but if you look at 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 14, as you go further into it, look at this verse for a moment. See if I got the right verse in here. You know what I mean? Got the right verse. I don't think I do. Let me see. It might be 2 King. Let me see. It's find it. 24. Oh, actually, yeah. Okay, it's 24. 1 Kings 14:24 says, and there were also Sodomites in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. And so there's, Sodomites in the land, and it goes on to explain later how they were cast out. And so we see that this is just learning from Israel what they did, how they operated. But when he said there were Sodomites in the land, we see there that they were cast out. So this is something that you read about here, not only in Genesis, not only in Leviticus, not only in 1 Kings, but it also goes into Paul's epistles as well. And we can see this in Romans chapter 1, verse 26. Just in case we think that it's only dealt with, say, prophecy. It also goes into mystery, Romans chapter 1, verse 26. And what we see there says, for this cause, and that's the cause of changing the truth into a lie, God gave them up into vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient. So we see that in Romans chapter 1, verse 26, 27, 28. And then it also goes on, I believe it's in 1 Timothy 1:10. And the main one is, you can also see in, and we won't turn to it just for time's sake, but Jude chapter 1, verse 7 goes on to explain that Sodom and Gomorrah was all about the idea of a vile flesh. And that's why Sodom and Gomorrah fell. A lot of times they say, well, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't all about the sin of homosexuality or whatever it was, or sodomy. It was about something else. But Jude 1:7 says, yes, it was. So when we see that, and we come back to Leviticus, we're seeing there's some lessons you can take, teach, explain the mind of God on certain matters. And that's, this is a battleground chapter. People don't want to accept it. They fight it, debate it, whatever it is. But Leviticus 18, taken with Romans 1, taken with 1 Kings 14, taken with Jude chapter 1, helps that battle get, fought a little bit better. So we see that, and we go into Leviticus 19 as we go further. Leviticus 19 just goes on to explain with this chapter God's attitude of justice while having a heart of mercy. And what I mean by that, if we see in Leviticus 19, verse 9, he goes on to read, there's certain laws in here that just, you see the mind of God with certain rules and laws and everything else. Leviticus 19, verse 9 goes on to read, when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Thou shalt not, or ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. So he goes on to explain things like this. I'm seeing a little bit about this here. And then he goes on to say in verse, verse 13, actually even the end of verse 12, thou shalt not profane the name of the Lord thy God, I am the Lord. See God's mind on that subject. Verse 13, thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. Thou shalt fear thy God, I am the Lord. You're just seeing these different concepts, these different ways on how God views certain things. Don't rob this person. Don't falsify things. Don't profane my name. Don't speak harsh or falsely. Don't do unrighteousness and judgment. He said in verse 15, don't disrespect the persons of the poor, nor honor the persons of the mighty, but in righteousness judge everybody. That's verse 15. So he says that. And so as he goes through, don't be a talebearer. He goes on and talks about this here. And let me see, that's verse 19. If we go into verse 27, Leviticus 19, verse 27, he goes on to say, thou shalt, or ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. So you're seeing all these different things on what he's, how he's talking and everything else. It's how he's dealing and distributing justice with mercy. Everything from what we were seeing in verse 1 all the way through. So you're seeing these laws and rules are not for us. We don't get righteousness by how short we trim our beards or how we do or don't put cuttings in our flesh or whatever it is. But nonetheless, he's setting these standards up. In this case, we look back and we understand his mind on the subject matter, but nonetheless, these are the things that he's teaching to Israel, that these are just flat out laws for them. And none of them keep it, but they are supposed to uphold it nonetheless, and they all fall short. But this is something that we're seeing in verse 19. His attitude of justice with rules and laws while still having a heart of mercy. So when you look at this, you're seeing he's merciful, he's graceful, he's loving by giving these rules and laws for order and structure to a nation that's coming about. So we're seeing this here, and he goes on, just as a whole list in Leviticus chapter 19. So they're all sets of different things. It's not any one subject matter. The subject matter actually kind of changes from verse to verse. But nonetheless, there's mercy to be found while there's justice to be found. And that's something you can learn about God, who he is. And nonetheless, while he will establish structure and order, he will look to establish mercy with that as well. So that's something we can learn as a spiritual lesson from Leviticus chapter 19. Going into chapter 20, he goes on to, we see in this chapter, multiple laws prohibiting Israel for searching for things other than the Lord for fulfillment. So we look in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 1. And it says that the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, again, thou shalt say to the children of Israel, whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth any of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. And I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from among his people. He hath given of his seed unto Molech to defile my sanctuary, and to profane my holy name. Goes on and explains it like that. But if you look at verse 6, he says, and the soul that turneth after such as have familiar spirits, and after wizards to go a-whoring after them, I will even set my face against that soul. So he's looking to explain, don't go finding fulfillment after familiar spirits, or after wizards, or after sorcery, or after this. The fulfillment is found in the Lord himself. And don't go after Molech, don't go after these different things that are out there, in this case for the children of Israel. Don't go after these other things looking for fulfillment or looking for other things. It's the Lord himself that will bring that. And so he says this here, and then I believe it's even verse 10, goes on to explain the idea more about the right relationships by not seeking fulfillment in wrong things. And he says, and the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Of course, we ourselves are not in charge of doing anything like that. But we see that God's mind on the subject, we see that there, but we're seeing not to go find fulfillment in wrong things. That's the spiritual lesson we're learning from that. And then believe in verse 22, Leviticus 20, verse 22, he says, ye shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them, that the land whither I bring you to dwell therein spare you not out, and ye shall not walk in the manners of the nation which I cast out before you, for they committed all these things, and therefore I abhorred them. But I have said unto you, ye shall inherit the land, and will give it unto you to possess it. It flows with milk and honey. And so we're seeing this is all directed for Israel, but they're seeing there's curses if they disobey, blessings if they do. That's that covenant standing that we kind of talk about sometimes, or a lot of times in our studies, that Israel has this covenant standing. Blessed if you do, cursed if you don't. So we see that in here in Leviticus chapter 20. And that they're not to go finding fulfillment after wrong, wicked, bad things. That's something we should keep in our mindset. Israel had to keep in their mindset, and how the Pauline pattern sets that up in their structure as well. If we look at, say, Titus chapter 2, verse 14, going into Titus. Titus chapter 2, verse 14. To go find fulfillment, or to see that what we should be zealous of when we look for righteous fulfillment in the dispensation of grace. It says that who gave himself for us, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify to himself a peculiar people zealous of good works. So if anything we want to be zealous of and find fulfillment in, it would be the Lord Jesus Christ himself, that we would be zealous of good works. So we see that through Titus chapter 2, verse 14. That's something we can learn from there. Other things would be, we won't go to it, but going back to Ephesians 5, verse 7 through 11, we can learn through Ephesians as well. But we'll continue on just for time's sake as we keep going. Leviticus chapter 21, going into part 3 of our outline. We're seeing more about more laws and rules are given. Of course, it's Leviticus. That's what you're going to find. And so we'll keep looking at the more historical information, historical accounts, more spiritual lessons we can gain from, and see what we can find as well. More doctrinal information we can find out about how things work. And so we see there are more laws about contact with the dead, and we'll kind of take a look at that, how Jesus Christ went above that with Lazarus. And Levitical priests, we'll find out Israel had a Levitical priesthood, Aaronic priesthood. They could easily go ahead and marry. And so when you look at, say, the religious priests today, they call themselves Catholics, and how they're held back from marrying. They didn't get that from the Bible, so I don't know what's going on with that. But we'll take a look at that as well. They have to marry a virgin. That's just their standards. And then how physical defects are not allowed in God's presence. And we'll see how this works out here in Leviticus chapter 21. But Leviticus 21, verse 1 goes on to read, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Speak unto the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say unto them, There shall none be defiled for the dead among his people, but for his kin that is near unto him, that is, for his mother, and for his father, and for his son, for his daughter, and for his brother, and for his sister a virgin that is nigh unto him, which hath had no husband, for her may he be defiled. But he shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people, to profane himself. They shall not make baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corner of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh." So you see more laws and rules about how you're supposed to specifically, as a Jew, shape your beard and everything else, and have specific or not have specific cuttings in your flesh or carvings in your flesh or so on. This was a Jewish ordinance. And then it says, "They shall be holy unto their God, and not profane the name of their God. For their offerings of the Lord made by fire, and the bread of their God they do offer. Therefore they shall be holy." Starts out with that. But then, so we're reading more about contact with the dead that goes on this, and different rules and laws that go on about contact with the dead. And then it goes into, we won't turn to it, but we know through John chapter 11 how there was rules about if you touch the dead, you have to stay away, you have to remain unclean for 7 days until you can return back into the camp concerning these Levitical times. The Lord Jesus Christ shows up and just goes into Lazarus. He's been dead for 4 days. He goes in, and they even say, his body stinks, and he's been dead for so long. He goes in and raises him from the dead. He's God. He can do anything. He can go, he can not only set up the law, but he can go forth and go beyond the law. He's above the law. He's someone who has the law. He obeys it. He fulfills it, goes beyond it, does whatever he needs to do, him being God in the flesh. So we know that from John chapter 11, verse 38 to 44. In Leviticus chapter 21, verse 10, here's where we find out that priests of Israel, Levitical priests, can go ahead and marry. It says, and he that is the priest among his brethren, upon whose head the anointing oil was poured, and that is consecrated to put on the garment, shall not uncover his head, nor rend his clothes. Now, just as a side note, that's an interesting thing about uncovering his head. That's another study for another chapter, for another thing, you know, the head coverings and everything else. That's interesting to see, but that's a whole nother ball game for a whole nother day. Nor rend his clothes. It says, neither shall he go into any dead body, nor defile himself for his father, or for his mother. Neither shall he go out to the sanctuary or profane the sanctuary of his God. And then he says in verse 13, for he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow or a divorced woman or a profane or an harlot. These shall he not take, but he shall take a virgin of his own people to wife. So he's good to take a wife, but the standard is this priest has to take a wife, a virgin. Can't be a widow, can't be a divorced woman, can't be profane, can't be an harlot, but it can be a virgin. That's the law. That's the law for the priest. If they want to go ahead and marry, they can take a wife. So what the Catholics are doing, I have no idea, because the Levitical priesthood, they could go ahead and marry if they chose. What they're doing is something on their own, something that's unbiblical, something that's not related to the Bible. So we see that in Leviticus chapter 21. And as it goes through here, it says, he will make, if we go to zoom down to verse 16, and we'll find something else here, that priest, Levitical priest of Israel, can have no physical defects whatsoever. They have to be in perfect health. And of course, we know through prophecy comes healing. That's how these priests then keep their physical health. We also know that in Exodus 19, that the entire group of Israel, all of Israel, are to be a nation of priests. The whole nation is to be priests. So we see there in Leviticus chapter 21, verse 16, goes on to read, if I can find that here. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron, saying, whosoever he be of thy seed, and their generations that have any blemish, let him not approach thee to offer the bread of his God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach, a blind man, or a lame, or he that hath a flat nose, or anything superfluous, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or crook-backed, or a dwarf, or that hath a blemish in his eye, or be scurvy, or scabbed, or hath his stones broken, or a man that hath a blemish of the seed of Aaron, the priest, shall come nigh to offer the offerings of the Lord made by fire. He hath a blemish. He shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God. He shall eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and of the holy. Only he shall not go in unto the veil, nor come nigh unto the altar, because he hath a blemish. That he profane not my sanctuaries, for I, the Lord, do sanctify them. And Moses goes and tells this to everybody. If you are to be a priest in Israel, you have to have perfect health, no blemishes, nothing. And so we know this through, follow my notes here, that there will be no physical defects, allowed in God's presence. We see that law here in Leviticus chapter 21. The way this will work out is when the kingdom comes. Some cross references I have in the outline is Hosea chapter 6 verse 1, Malachi chapter 4 verse 2, Revelation 21:4, and Revelation 22:2 is going to be that he will restore perfect health. He'll lift the curse of sin. He'll give Israel, the whole nation of priests, perfect health. He'll give them that, which is why if we look at Matthew chapter 5 verse 29, you see verses like this. Kind of answers kind of a lifelong question. Matthew chapter 5 verse 29. We might have covered this before, but if they're going into the kingdom and they will receive perfect health and the curse of sin will be lifted and it'll be paradise on earth and the whole nation of priests are going to be doing well. This is why we find instructions in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, such as Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, which reads, if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish and that the whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off they're going to go into a kingdom missing a hand or missing an eye or missing whatever they miss because it's offending them or they're doing wrong or they're sinning. They're not able to obey the laws or whatever it may be. It's better to cut it off and get it back later when they restore or they're restored in perfect health, as we see there, because they will be a nation of priests, and all priests must have perfect health, no blemishes. We see that from Leviticus chapter 21. So it's better to cut off your eye or cut off your hand. He's using those just as examples for Israel. And of course, not for us. We're not going to go off and do that. But we're seeing that in Leviticus 21, not a blemish, not one single issue. Those verses I gave out on our outline shows God will restore them, perfect health. But it's better to get into that kingdom, fight your way in there, go into that tribulation with the Antichrist and all these issues going on, maimed and everything else, and get your health back later. So just a thought as we continue on. This is why we're going through the book of Leviticus. We're learning a whole bunch of things on how God views things. We're putting verses together. We're getting spiritual lessons, historical lessons, doctrinal lessons, and how we can better learn on how Paul might view this, or how we would view this in the mind of Christ, see how the little flock would view this. And so we're learning all these deeper lessons to go forward with this rightly divided. So we see that from chapter 21, and now going into Leviticus chapter 22, we only got a few more chapters and we're done. Leviticus chapter 22 just talks about how they need to offer a flawless male, and how the concept of how a priest can purchase people in this case, and that they need to be a hallowed people and not to go around profaning. So Leviticus chapter 22 verse 1 goes on to read, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and to his sons, that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, and that they profane not my holy name in those things which they hallow unto me. I am the Lord. Saying to them, whosoever he be of all your seed among your generations, that goeth unto the holy things, which the children of Israel hallow unto the Lord, that having his uncleanness upon him, that soul shall be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. What man soever of the seed of Aaron is a leper, or hath a running issue, he shall not eat of the holy things until he be clean." And it goes on talking more about these things, about the creeping thing, and how they're made clean or unclean. Whoever touches this, they're unclean, and then they got to go wash themselves with water. We're kind of seeing more about this. And then it says that, and when the sun is down in verse 7, he shall be clean, and afterward eat of the holy things, because it is his food. Verse 8, that which dieth of itself, or is torn with beast, he shall not eat to defile himself therewith. I am the Lord. So it goes on to explain all these different things that we're seeing in chapter 22. And in some of the cases, it goes on to talk about offering a flawless male as a sacrifice in certain cases that we're seeing here. Sacrifices, in other words. We're kind of zooming through the chapter, but we can see where the concept goes. The spiritual lesson is applied about offering a flawless male. That would be the Lord Jesus Christ. And we saw that as you look at that with Paul's epistles, Romans 4, Romans 5, Colossians 1, Ephesians 5 as well. It goes through there. And it goes on more, even if we look at verse 15, Leviticus 22, verse 15. This is what we were talking about a little bit a moment ago, talking about how Israel needs to be a hallowed people, a holy people, not profaning. It says in Leviticus 22, verse 15, "And they shall not profane the holy things of the children of Israel, which they offer unto the Lord, or suffer them to bear the iniquity of trespass when they eat their holy things, for I, the Lord, do sanctify them." So again, we're learning from the chapter that they are not to go around profaning holy things. And so we think about that kind of lesson in the dispensation of grace. Don't go around profaning holy things. And we see that there. It also goes on to talk about suffer them to bear the iniquity of trespass. The Lord sanctifies them. We can learn from that. Again, there's so much just to pick up in a single chapter of Leviticus. But we know we do better by Paul. So nonetheless, this is just building for more information we can just kind of learn from Paul with. So we see that in Leviticus chapter 22. Going into Leviticus chapter 23, goes on to see that we're to be grateful, or more so in this case Israel, is to be grateful for all that God has done. And for Israel, it was through all these different feasts and the representations of what God did in regards for them, in their history. And so all these different feasts that we read about in Leviticus chapter 23, and I'll kind of skip and let everyone read the different feasts. The Feast of Booths, Feasts of Tabernacles, the Passover, they all mean something that has to do with Israel and their history and the representation thereof. Sabbaths and free will offerings and feast days and tabernacles, and things like that. They all have something to do with Israel, their history, their plan, their purpose, prophetic purpose. And so it's going to go through and explain that, but just a little bit. And Leviticus chapter 23 goes on to read in verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. It goes on explaining about the Passover in verse 5, and then it goes on explaining just more and more. We won't go through every single one of them, but you can go through every single one of them and find details on what you would like to explain to somebody concerning Christ or concerning the joys of celebrating the Lord and everything that he's done. In our case, we would celebrate what Christ has given to Paul concerning the revelation of the mystery, the cross, salvation, grace, redemption. And of course, Leviticus isn't the book we would go to do that in, but we can find lessons about that. We can see that whatsoever was written aforetime was written for our learning, so we can see how Israel was to celebrate what God has done for them. Therefore, we can go and do the same and rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, and find reasons to rejoice in what the cross means for us. So we're finding that in Leviticus chapter 23. And so we go through that. Then when we get to Leviticus chapter 24, right there. And as we go through here, we find that we're getting into a part here, more talking about temple bread. And this gets into more so explaining what they're to do. And I think it's going to be in the first 8 verses, talking about this concept of olive oil, temple bread, things like this, and the laws concerning it, how to make it, what to do with it, and so on. And let me see, it's going to go on to say, same verse 5, Leviticus 24, verse 5. Thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. 2/10 deals shall be 1 cake, and thou shalt set them in the 2 rows, 6 on a row, upon the pure table before the Lord. And thou shalt put pure frankincense upon each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord, continually being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. Goes on to explain all these things. So we're seeing some things about what we're reading about olive oil and table bread and so on and so forth in regards to the tabernacle, in regards to how reconciliation takes place with Israel, how the grace that God would give in these laws to Israel that they could do these things, and how it plays out. And that's in Leviticus chapter 24, but more so you see how this plays out as Israel's history continues. If we look at 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 5. 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 5. Now we're moving into King Saul and King David and events that are happening in this day and time. And we're going to run to that bread again, the tabernacle again, the priests again. And then first King, I said?
1 Samuel.
1 Samuel, okay. 1 Samuel 21, and we get there in verse 5. Yeah, we see there that he's going to come across this bread you're reading about in Leviticus. And therefore you can see how the instructions that God's literally giving them in Leviticus chapter 24 plays out, not only throughout Israel's history, but how it's coming into play here in in 1 Samuel 21. So we see in Leviticus, I keep saying that, but 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 5 says, And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth, won't have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is of a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. David's running from Saul. He needs something to eat. The priest gives him hallowed bread to eat from the tabernacle. And so while we read that in verse Leviticus, or it comes from Leviticus 24, the priest recognized from our outline, we're saying that the human need over Levitical observance. David was hungry. He's running from Saul. He needs something to eat. The priest says, go ahead and eat this. Your human need takes place over Levitical observance. And the observance was to recognize that need. And just like us today, we would sooner have souls saved and saints edified over, say, Levitical religious observance. And so, the priest was probably wrong in a lot of ways, right in a lot of ways. Just depending on how we study that, that's probably a whole nother study for a whole nother thing. But giving David the showbread. But nonetheless, he did that, and you can kind of take a little lesson away from that, saying that we don't want to get too tied up in the Levitical parts of a conversation as much as we're getting salvation out to a new person or getting edification out to a saved person. Let's leave the Levitical parts out for a later date or whatever it may be, as much as we want to get them edified and saved and sound and get that sound doctrine into them. Something we can learn from Leviticus, say, 24, as well as you can take those bread of life studies. The Lord comes and says, I am the bread of life. You can take that. That's the book of John. Nothing wrong with that. If you want to explain that to a new believer, a new person, it's something you can run with and teach about. You hear those things come up a little bit. Something you can teach from that. So we see that there. And then as we go into Leviticus chapter 25, let's see, we go there. Talks more about the year of Jubilee in Leviticus chapter 25, how security and equality is among the people, or is supposed to be at least. Redemption, it's redemption of property. The idea of 6 years of work and 1 year of rest also goes with creation week. And the rest is also an issue that comes up with Israel. It kind of comes up towards the goal of when the kingdom comes, they have this kingdom rest. And that's another study as well, where you can read that in the book of Hebrews, where when Israel comes, the curse of sin is lifted, Israel goes into their kingdom, and they have this rest, this time of rest, where they can enjoy where they're in the kingdom. And so we see that given as an example there. But they have in this Leviticus 25 a year of Jubilee, where there's security and equality going on as well, and this redemption of property. And so we see this idea of redemption being explained. We see all sorts of issues going on in the book of Leviticus, like we were saying earlier: grace, redemption, reconciliation, faith. And of course, they're having faith in covenants, they're having faith in laws, they're having faith that these things will bring them righteousness. This is, of course, not our book where we're going to go do these things, but we're learning all these things and then seeing the mind of God in greater detail or more detail, that we learn how he sees certain things, how he thinks about certain situations or details or issues. And we take them and put them in the Paul a little bit better or a little more. So we see that from Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 1, goes on to say, and the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed. It is a year of rest unto the land. And so you kind of see the creation week kind of does the same idea, and you see a little bit more based on what you're seeing in Leviticus 25. Then it goes from there, that year of Jubilee, security, equality, rest, after you have 6 days of work and rest on the seventh when it comes to creation week. And you're seeing the idea of 6 years of work and rest on the seventh year when it comes to the idea of a jubilee. So more we learn from this. And let me see. Oh yeah, okay. Then when you get to Leviticus chapter 26, and then there's more laws, of course, in Leviticus 25. So there's a lot that goes on there. But Leviticus chapter 26 goes on talking about idolatry, first couple verses. But mainly, you get into 5 phases of judgment, where God says, if you fail to obey, I'm your God, you're my people. This is the covenant I'm making with you, Israel. But if you fail to obey me, first, this is going to happen. And if you still don't obey me, second, this is going to happen. And if you don't obey me further, then third, this is going to happen. He kind of explains, and then fourth, and then fifth. After the fifth, that's it. And so he explains that there's going to be 5 phases where things are going to happen if you don't obey this covenant. And it won't happen, just like that, but it will happen in 5 phases. And we actually find this occurring in the Bible, based on Leviticus, based on this is the covenant. If I make a deal with you, like I'll sell you my blender for $50, and if you don't give it to me, first I'm going to do this, and second I'll do that, third I'll do this, and fourth I'll do this, and fifth I'll do this if I don't get it. That type of covenant, that type of agreement. But you're saying with God and Israel, they're making an agreement or a covenant, saying here's all the laws you need to obey, and if you don't obey it, first it's this, then it's this, then it's this, then it's this, then it's this. So in Leviticus chapter 26, goes on to say in Leviticus 26 verse 13, he says, judgment number 1, Leviticus 26 verse 13, I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that ye should not be their bondmen. And I have broken the bonds of your yoke, and made you go upright. But if ye will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commands, and if ye shall despise my statutes, or if your soul will abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning ague, that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemy shall eat it. And then he goes on to say, and I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies, that they hate you, or they that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. So when you hear that phrase, see that in verse 17, and I will set my face against you. And then I think there's a verse, whether it be in Chronicles or Psalms, and they say that may the Lord shine his face upon you. Because they want the Lord looking at them. And that's not just a cute little bumper sticker phrase. They want, when the Lord sets his face against them, that's an anthropomorphism. The Lord's literal face, whether he has literal face, literal eyes, literal arms and hands and everything else is one thing. But the point that they're understanding is that he's not with them if they disobey him. And so he's saying, I will set my face against you. And so they want him, they want him looking at them, and they want his face shining upon them. Some church groups say that. They say, oh, may the Lord shine his face upon you. That's what they want. But he's saying, I'm going to set my face against you. And so that's number 1. And that actually takes place. That starts out with the book of Judges all the way into King Saul. And so that kicks in where you see them, and then as a cross-reference, you can read all about it on Judges chapter 1, verse 11 through 1 Samuel 15, verse 35. It's on judgment on Israel's health and on Israel's borders. And this truly does come into play. So we see that that's step 1, if they disobey. Step 2 says in verse 18, it goes even further on Israel's power and Israel's climate. It goes on to say, and that was, what we just saw was the book of Judges into King Saul. He says, and if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. So now we're going deeper. He says, and I will break the pride of your power, And I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. And your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. And you read about that in when you read about Elijah in First Kings, Second Kings. He's going through droughts, and the land's not bearing anything. And so you're seeing this kick in 7 times more for Israel, which was supposed to be a land of milk and honey, and yet you're seeing the land drying up, and everything's kicking in like it is. And so that takes place with their power and climate for judgment number 2. And then as it goes in even deeper, then he throws in some wild beast into the action. And then judgment number 3 goes on to read in verse 21, and if ye walk contrary unto me, and will not hearken unto me, I will bring 7 times more plagues upon you according to your sins. I will also send wild beasts among you, which shall rob you of your children, and destroy your cattle, and make you few in number, and your highways shall be desolate. So we see that kick in here with judgment number 3, and you can read this with Elisha. With Elijah, there were children that went out and called Elijah. They said, thou bald head, and they were insulting him. And out from the forest came bears and mauled them to death, mauled the children of Israel to death. Those are in, let's see if I got them here, 2 Kings 1, 11 through 2 Kings 10:31. You can read about that in those chapters. So it goes through that, but that's just judgment 1, 2, and 3. It keeps going in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 23, and so it moves on to invasions of other countries into Israel and famines. And it goes on to read that, and if you will not be reformed by me by these things, but will walk contrary unto me, then I will also walk contrary unto you, and will punish you 7 times for your sins, or yet 7 times for your sins. And I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. And when ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver you and your bread again by weight, and ye shall eat and not be satisfied. And we see that kick in 2 Kings 10 all the way through chapter 16. So that kicks in. There's all these different kings going on. You have a good king, and you have a bad king, and a good king and a bad king. But this is going on as well. You see some others actually cannibalize and eat their own children. This goes on in the book of Kings. And this is actual historical accounts of what actually happened in real life in the book of Chronicles, Kings with Israel. And we're seeing the lesson to be learned from all this is what God's phases of punishments was to occur if they disobeyed the 613 points of law. And we're seeing how this all came to pass all the way from the book of Judges, when now we're moving into the book of Kings as progressive revelation moves along in Israel's timeline. You can teach this to someone who wants to know what the book of Leviticus is all about, and show them this, that as they disobey, God stays true to his word, even if Israel doesn't stay true to theirs. And that's a good lesson to teach too. So we see that there. Going into verse, or that was judgment 4. Judgment 5 goes on to read in verse 27, Leviticus chapter 26, 27. And if ye will not for all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I will walk contrary unto you also in fury. And I will chastise you 7 times for your sins. And ye shall eat the flesh of your sons, and there it is there, and the flesh of your daughters ye shall eat. And I will destroy your high places, and cut down your images, and cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my soul shall abhor you. Now, I've seen a lot of doomsday, end times magazines that don't rightly divide. They don't know how to rightly divide. And they take Leviticus 26 and say, well, that's America right now today, because it's not as godly as it used to be. And 9/11 fits into Leviticus 26. And so they spin everything based on the headlines you read every day. And we definitely don't want to do that. But they'll do all this based on what you're reading here. But this all has to do with Israel and their 613 laws. And so we see this here. And it goes on to say in verse 31, make your cities waste. That would be the different Philistines coming in. That would be the Assyrians coming in, the Babylonians coming in. And it goes on from there. And then he says, even in verse 32, and I will bring the land to desolation. Your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. He says, and I will scatter you among the heathen. Well, he does that for sure. And will draw the sword after you, and your land will be desolate, and your cities waste. And then the land will enjoy her Sabbaths. And it goes on through there. I'm trying to see if there's anything beyond. Verse 38 goes on, and ye shall perish among the heathen, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up. And they that are left of you shall pine away in their iniquity in your enemies' lands, and also in the iniquities of their fathers shall they pine away with them. And then he goes on to explain all this here. And he kind of puts it in reverse, saying, well, if you start getting better, then things will start getting better as well. Now, there's that covenant standing. The worse they are, the worse it gets. The better they are, the better it gets, which is definitely not us. But we see that those 5 stages of judgment, which in that 5th one, talking about that captivity that's going to take place, or that does end up taking place, the Babylonian captivity based on Leviticus chapter 26, verses 27 through 39, which we just read. That kicks in all the way through 2 Kings, goes all the way from 17 to the end. You read about it in the minor prophets, the major prophets. You can see it even in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Romans are ruling over the Jews. And then you can read even into Hebrews through Revelation, where the Antichrist is ruling over. And so, and then they hide from it, they run from it. So we see that. Then we go into our final book, our final chapter of the book, Leviticus chapter 27. And here what we see is just the core of the law, to honor God with people, animals, houses, property, and more. The Levitical monumental work done by God, as we can kind of compare and contrast it to salvation for the body of Christ today, is to honor God with thankfulness for his work, in this case done on the cross. And so we see that there. And you see a little bit in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 1, saying, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speaking to the children of Israel, and saying to them, when a man shall make a singular vow, the person shall be for the Lord by thy estimation. And the estimation shall be the male from 20 years, even 20 years old, even unto 60 years old. And kind of goes on from there, talking about shekels of silver, and if a female, then it's going to be this. And it goes on explaining, certain rules and laws concerning God's mind on a certain subject from there, in a certain valuation. But they're to honor God with people, with houses, and even animals. If you look at, I believe it's verse 9 in Leviticus chapter 27, whether it be a male, a female, there's a certain value that each one has, and they're to honor God with that right value. He says, and if it be a beast whereof men bring an offering unto the Lord, all that any man giveth of such unto the Lord shall be holy. He shall not alter it nor change it, good for a bad or a bad for a good. And if he shall at all change beast for beast, then it and the exchange thereof shall be holy. And if it be any unclean beast of which they do not offer a sacrifice unto the Lord, then he shall present the beast before the priest. And the priest shall value it, or whether it be good or bad, as thou valuest it, who art the priest, so shall it be. And so he's just talking about the value of what's being offered unto the Lord, that there's going to be a judgment of what's being offered. And we can think about that as, the judgment seat of Christ, that there's going to be a value of what we give an account of what's being offered. And that's nothing to do with sin, as we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 3. But just as we're seeing there are things being offered and there's a judgment being evaluated, there's a value to be valued based on whether it be man, woman, child, beast, that type of thing. The value shouldn't be altered, but should be properly justified. And so we're seeing when we give an account at the judgment seat of Christ, God's not going to spin it or alter it. It's going to be properly justified in his sight. The account that we give as members of the church, the body of Christ. And so therefore, that's why we should honor God in all that we do. Taking this kind of lesson that we're seeing in Leviticus chapter 27. And it kind of goes from there. We should honor God in thankfulness for the work he's done for us on the cross. And there's a lot more in there. And there's actually a whole lot more in the book of Leviticus than what we just went through. But I did want to go through, take these 2 weeks and kind of go through the book of Leviticus, just pulling out different historical, doctrinal, spiritual lessons we could kind of gain from it And then as we see in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 34, saying, these are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. So we see there the context, the group, the audience, the different dispensation, the fact we're not under any of these things. Definitely let the law bring you to Paul, which is Christ, essentially bringing you to Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery with God's grace on the forefront. But I wanted to go through this, just see if there was something that hopefully there would be more details on God's mind that would kind of come out towards different subject matters, all sorts of different subject matters, as there's all sorts of different laws, so there'd be all sorts of different subjects. And hopefully that would expand upon the mindset of God, the personality of God, judgments of God, and how we can equate it or fine tune it into the dispensation of grace. Let some things go, put some things in, and understand God a little better. So with that, I'll open up to any kind of thoughts or questions, comments on what we just went through.
I'm just grateful we're in the dispensation of grace and enjoying the simplicity of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is very complex,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so easy to make a mistake.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, in addition to that, even if, like when you point out Matthew, it occurred to me every time I heard that, if your arm sins or whatever the case may be, your eyes pluck your eye and all that kind of, it was totally taken out of context from what you just explained.
Yeah.
Totally. So how anybody can listen, I mean, after the last 2 weeks, how anybody could listen or read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and think that it was written for them is just, I just don't get it.
Yeah.
I just don't get it.
Yeah, they following Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that you brought up that God is in the details, because he doesn't do anything haphazardly, and we may not understand why, but he has a reason for it. Like why they didn't eat pork, because trichinosis and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting for me is you've got all these details on sacrifice.
Mhm.
And the whole point technically was, don't sin, you don't need to sacrifice.
Mhm.
But it was kind of like, well, we got to sacrifice for this so we can go ahead and do whatever we want. So technically you wouldn't have had any sacrifices. Practically though, God knew that they couldn't keep, and we know that we can't keep the law.
Yeah.
So you will have sacrifices, but I don't know how many compared to actually occurred. I don't know.
Yeah.
Last thought is, I don't know if you had heard, I don't remember where I got this from, but the like the type of the harvest, or the shadow of the harvest. You've got first fruits, you've got the main harvest, and then you've got the gleanings.
Mhm.
And I kind of heard that, I could be wrong, but I had heard that like the first resurrection would be like the first fruits of the harvest.
Mhm.
The bulk of the harvest would be the rapture, because that's been 2,000 years with all these people. And then the gleanings would be the last ones that get in to the kingdom through the tribulation, because there wouldn't be as many.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know, that could be.
Yeah.
or tradition or something. I don't know,
Yeah.
but it just an interesting thought.
Yeah, yeah. If it helps explain something to somebody and you use that as an example, I mean, if it works, use it, you know?
Yeah, I'm not going to stand on that dogmatically and say
Yeah.
it's good, that's right. No,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if it helps explain something to somebody.
but we'll find out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
We'll
true.
find.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that was a good study. Like you keep bringing it back to Paul and you know it. Going through the Old Testament, you see God's faithfulness. You see God's trustworthiness. That He keeps His word. So even though it doesn't impact us directly for doctrine, I mean, you see God's character.
Yeah.
Now you think, yeah, Levit. When I do my annual Bible reading throughs, which I'm getting ready to finish up here by the end of the month, about 4-5 months early. Yeah, you think Leviticus is detailed. Man, what always gets me is numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, all the, this number of people for this tribe and it's,
Mhm.
oh my goodness. Please don't give me please make it multiple choice, if you're going to test me.
No kidding.
Please don't make it essay. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
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 Go ahead.
I was just saying, I always learned that it's an enjoyable thing to learn that's why the details are there, because God's so detailed. So I can kind of, it's still tough to read it because I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
there's so much detail in there. But it's good to see that that's a part of who God is and say, oh, now I know why it's there.
Yeah, it's not just willy-nilly, close enough.
Yeah.
Like churchianity today. Yeah, close enough. We'll call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good enough for God. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You don't do it right. He knows.
Oh, yeah.
And even though they did the sacrifices, even though they went through the motions, you needed to have the right mind and heart why you were doing the sacrifice, while you were doing the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because God doesn't want the blood of bulls. He wants your heart. He wants your mind.
Yeah. 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 He says that, I think Isaiah 1 or something.
Yeah, somewhere he says, do your feast days are, I don't want any of it anymore. I don't want any of your sacrifices. I don't want any of your feast days. I don't want any of it because you're just doing it to check the box and
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I don't have your heart.
Yeah. Let's see.
Isaiah 1:11 says, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord?
There you go.
I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of the fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of goats."
Yeah.
What he said. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I meant. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had questioned John several times, is why is all of this, why is all of this in here? I mean, I get that God is very detailed, but why is he so detailed? And then actually I've come to the conclusion through John's coaching is that maybe we don't understand everything, but God has a purpose and he understands and he knows the end game. And, so that's part of our trust and our faith is that, do it as God asks you to do it, because there is a reason. So,
I think you said it in the lesson that, our minds are not God's mind, the same as God's mind. I mean, he's a whole different life form, if you want to say it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Than we are.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's brought us into his life form and him into us, it's just amazing to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a being that's infinite, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just hard to grasp sometimes. You just sit there and go, huh?
In our minds, it's hard to grasp, right?
In our minds, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That's it. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions or anything?
I'm thinking.
Oh, did I answer Nicholas's question? Did I go in there? I saw something earlier. Day of Redemption.
Yeah, you did.
Okay. Was it? I think it was something about Romans 8 with. Yeah, I think it was specifically Romans 8:21 through 23. Yeah, that would be that. Day of
A lot of-
Redemption.
A lot of good deep questions lately, Nicholas.
Yeah, he's studying. You can tell he's digging in there. He's
Yeah.
digging in.
I
Which
just
is
have
good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's say I got another one, but I'll wait for the chat room.
That's fine. But
Yeah. Whatever you want to do, you can ask now. You can ask later. It's all up to you.
I just kind of wandered into it and gave my 2 cents on a few things. And
Yeah.
It all helps. Everything helps.
You good? No. Okay. Well, we'll be back here Wednesday, and yeah, chat room's open all the time for questions and everything else. And good to see everyone. And,
glad I could make it today.
yeah,
We're
glad you're
glad you
here.
could too.
Yeah, glad you're here.
Thank you.
Everybody's here.
everybody.
Glad everyone's here.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a rough morning. Didn't know if I was going to make it, but made it. Thank God.
Yeah,
Yes, we
always
do.
glad you're here. So-
Always.
So I gotta make a run for it. Pick up the wife from work, and we'll see everyone here.
All right.
All right, we'll see everyone Wednesday and Sunday again.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.